What's up everybody, welcome to another episode of China Update, where I try and help you guys keep on top of the macro developments coming out of China. For those of you watching for the first time, I work in China in an executive role, and a big part of my job is to follow those big macro developments. If you're interested in that sort of thing, and if you want to be just as informed as my clients, maybe consider subscribing. Everyone else, happy year of the ox. It's good to be back. I'm sorry last week I took some time off because it was the holiday. It's back into work this week. It's a new year, hopefully a new year on the lunar calendar, that is. Hopefully it's a better year than last year. As always guys, if you enjoy the video, it's a huge help if you smash the like button. Unfortunately, YouTube flags these videos as sensitive content, and so YouTube will not recommend them. Also, a big thanks to my Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome. Thank you very much for supporting a small YouTube channel like this. It really helps. And guess what? I now have enough money from this to actually start using stock video footage. So I'm going to use that for the first time on this episode. So hopefully it makes it a little bit more interesting than just staring at my mug for the whole episode. Okay, with all that said, let's jump into this week's China Update. This week's state-run Economic Information Daily released an announcement of a massive infrastructure spend for mostly northern provinces, which have seen the worst slowdown in debt issues over the last few years. The piece expresses that the PRC is launching a wave of infrastructure projects totaling 25 trillion RMB, approximately 4 trillion US dollars, in order to stimulate both consumption and growth. 100 industrial parks are to be built in Beijing alone to house high-tech companies. In Hebei, hundreds of billions will pour into high-tech sectors. Henan will see a new high-speed system and roading. The funding will come from local governments. This, of course, is very worrying for those economists in the PRC that have been calling for rebalancing away from unproductive public investment and infrastructure spending towards private investment and consumption. This debate continues with policymakers and will likely feature in this year's Lianghui, or two sessions. On this topic too, this week the State Council announced that there will be 200,000 kilometers of railways, 460 kilometers of roads, and 25,000 kilometers of bridges built by 2035, plus 400 airports, 27 coastal ports, 36 riverside ports, and 80 postal hubs. Last time on the channel we discussed historically low and very concerning birth rates. Well, this week we have another closely related report which gives reasons for concern regarding the medium to long-term sustainability and dynamism of the PRC economy. According to a report released by Tsinghua University's Evergrande Research Institute published this week, from 2013 to 2020, the number of marriage registrations fell from a record high of 13.47 million couples to 8.13 million. The average age for marriage rose to between 25 and 29 in 2020, instead of between 20 and 24 in 2013. Quote, "On the one hand, a new generation of young people pursue independence and freedom and think marriage is a bondage. On the other hand, the high cost of marriage and childbirth makes it more difficult for young people to realize their families. From the perspective of population, the aging population of fewer children is reducing the number of people of marriageable age and reducing the main force of marriage. If you don't want to get married, what children will you have? Is becoming the choice of a group of young people. The decline of marriage rate, fertility rate, and aging are mutually causal." End quote. Marriage rates fell differently among regions, and they were generally negatively correlated with GDP. The more prosperous a city is, the lower its marriage rate. Okay, next up, let's talk about the US-China trade relationship. It's increasingly likely, it seems, that the Biden administration is going to hold the PRC to the Phase 1 trade agreement signed during the Trump era. Quote, "I previously served as America's chief enforcer against China's unfair trade practices. I know firsthand how critically important it is that we have a strategic and coherent plan for holding China accountable to its promises and effectively competing with its model of state-directed economics. I know the opportunities and limitations in our existing toolkit, and I know how important it is to build what the president has termed, quote, a united front of US allies, end quote. Also, China needs to deliver on the promises it made in the Phase 1 agreement," end quote. So it looks like the Biden White House intends to enforce the Phase 1 agreement signed during the Trump era, literally days before the Wuhan shut down in January of 2020. We remember that last year the PRC was only able to meet about 50% of its purchasing commitments under the agreement. And while we're sort of on this theme of trade between the US and China, or lack of trade if there was decoupling, for example, a Rhodium report that was published this week concluded that full decoupling, meaning a complete cutoff of sales to China, would cost the US aircraft and aviation industry between $38 billion to $51 billion in sales annually, approximately 167,000 to 225,000 jobs lost. An end to US semiconductor sales to China too would cost the industry $83 billion in revenue and approximately 124,000 jobs. We should keep in mind, however, that when we discuss these numbers, that there is a huge asymmetry in the relative costs in the event of full decoupling between China and the US. 5% of PRC GDP is directly tied to exports to the United States market, whereas for the US, less than 0.5% of its GDP relies on exports to the PRC. Over the weekend, Beijing published its first major policy document in the year of the ox. This document was on, quote, rural revitalisation. Apart from the routine policy points like farmer incomes, infrastructure, etc. in rural areas, we can see that the document has identified self-reliance as a priority for the policy. Also in the document, it seems that the government is trying to prioritize and focus more on stimulating the internal circle in rural areas for the next 5 years. So again, we can see two key policy ideas from last year. One, this idea of self-reliance, and two, this idea of the internal cycle as part of Xi Jinping's dual circulation growth model, which we've discussed several times on the show. I think of the serious medium to long-term crises that China faces, the rural human capital challenge or crisis is probably the least followed of these, both internationally and within Chinese urban centers. Over half of China's population and the vast majority of China's children are from rural areas and have rural hukou, or household registration. This group has very, very little wealth and is very poorly educated. In fact, tens of millions of rural children have to pay for the final 4 years of public high school, which have fees higher than their households' annual incomes, and so they normally drop out at the age of about 13 because they can't afford to pay for their own public schooling. These low levels of basic education may leave many unable to find work in the formal workplace as China's economy changes. So the publication of this document suggests that the leadership in Beijing are increasingly concerned about this issue. Quote, rural revitalization serves as an anchor for the country's economic growth and social stability. It is not merely a matter of food security, but also a matter of labor supply and national development. End quote. Okay, for the quote of the week, I wanted to quote part of a long post that was made by Gao Yu, who is a deputy editor of Caixin Media, a non-state-run media outlet in China. Now he is, I would call him a proper journalist in the Western sense of a journalist, and Caixin Media is one of the few major media companies in China that really does try its best to courageously push what it is allowed to report on within the system here. The media companies here, whether it's state-run or non-state-run companies, operate in a highly restricted information environment. But there are journalists in some of these companies, like Caixin, for example, that do try and push that envelope as much as possible. Now, this post was taken down. It was widely shared online in China, but it was taken down after a few days, and we can get a sense of almost a sense of despair that this author is feeling, this editor, this journalist is feeling about the way in which regular Chinese are increasingly viewing journalists within China itself that are trying to get to the bottom of what is happening at local government levels. So this is part of what Gao Yu wrote, and I've included the full translation that was done by, I think it was China Media Project. They did an English translation of this. I'll put the link to the full post as well as an introduction to the post in the description below. So this is what he expressed. Quote, "The ranks of the self-confident are swelling, while those with critical thoughts are busy with self-mutilation. The scars of natural and human disasters alike are recast as military medals by the counterpoint of Westerners' foolishness. Our keyboard warriors hold up their magnifiers and besiege anyone on Weibo who dares to reveal the scars at all. Standing here on the last day of 2020, I dare to overstep the bounds and speak a single sentence, that all the efforts at enlightenment over the past 30 years, they have failed. More and more of the people we hope to help in breaking free from terror, they have become the people who despise us more than those who oppress them." End quote. This week, PRC Foreign Minister Wang Yi delivered a speech via video conference at the high-level segment of the 46th session of the UN Human Rights Council. This is the first time for a leader of the Chinese government to address the Human Rights Council. His words, as well as the words of state-run media, suggest that the PRC intends on trying to redefine human rights at the United Nations. Wang Yi expressed, quote, "Human rights are not a monopoly by a small number of countries. Still less should they be used as a tool to pressure other countries and meddle in their internal affairs." End quote. State-run Xinhua media expressed, quote, "Diversity in human rights development should be respected." End quote. And the Foreign Ministry itself expressed, quote, "China is ready to work with the international community to encourage the Human Rights Council to pursue the principle of impartiality, objectivity, and non-selectivity, attach equal importance to all categories of human rights, reject interference in other countries' internal affairs, and double standards under the pretext of human rights, and jointly promote the sound development of the international human rights cause." End quote. The Central Commission on Politics and Legal Affairs held a mobilization meeting for the Party History Study campaign this week. Now, this is a major campaign for General Secretary Xi Jinping, which will also be used to prepare for the 2022 20th Party Congress. The party has famously adopted two resolutions about the past, that is, two resolutions about history, one in 1945 to establish Mao Zedong as the absolute ruler of the party, and another in 1981 for Deng Xiaoping. So it seems that this campaign will be elevating Xi Jinping and Xi Jinping thought up to the places, say, a third era in CCP history. Chen Yixin, Secretary General of the Commission, gave a speech at the mobilization meeting in which he described how the Commission would conduct the campaign. This included, quote, "recognizing the four major functions of party history and learning and education, strengthen the party with history, use history to administer the country, use history to educate people, use history to forge the police," end quote. His speech also included, quote, "We have put the rule of China and the chaos of the West in stark contrast. The fundamental reason lies in the strong leadership of the CPC Central Committee with Comrade Xi Jinping at its core." Went on to say, quote, "The political and legal system is an instrument of the people's democratic dictatorship, and the struggle in the ideological field of politics and legal affairs is complex and acute. We must strengthen the politics and legal affairs systems, websites, newspapers, and other ideological fronts, strongly oppose historical nihilism, resolutely resist the West's so-called constitutionalism, separation of powers, judicial independence, and other erroneous thoughts that deny the leadership of the Communist Party of China and denigrates the socialist judicial system with Chinese characteristics." End quote. And last up, let's talk about Hong Kong, okay? On Monday, it was reported that at an annual legislative session in the mainland in March, PRC lawmakers are expected to vote on a proposal to change the composition of the 1,200 member committee that picks Hong Kong's top leader, the chief executive of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. Critics believe that this is a move to curb the influence of Hong Kong's opposition groups on the body. For example, the 117 seats assigned to Hong Kong's district councillors, a bloc now dominated by opposition groups, may be eliminated. Also on Tuesday, the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region government announced that anyone running for local positions will need to be a quote-unquote patriot. That is, they are required to swear loyalty to the mainland government. Chief Executive Carrie Lam supports the move, saying, quote, "I can understand that the central authorities are very concerned. They do not want the situation to deteriorate further in such a way that one country, two systems cannot be implemented." End quote.